So I was thinking about how Texas kicked off this wave of criminal justice reforms around the country, and what other things was Texas first in. So I've got a really bad list. I'm going to throw a couple things out here. Hopefully you can help me augment this. So my favorite soft drink is Dr. Pepper. I did not know Dr. Pepper was invented in Texas, right? And I also did not know that apparently there's not a period after the R in Dr. Pepper. Fritos, chili, the frozen margaritas, Texas firsts, right? Super Bowl was named here, the first dome stadium here in Texas. The first suspension bridge. Representative Moody, anybody else? Texas first, what else makes the list of Texas first? There's one really substantial one I came across. The others? Microchip, invented in Texas. That's hardly all surprising to you, but I throw it out just because it's really, quite frankly, hard to imagine looking back after 10 years of criminal justice reform here in Texas, that this state, of all states, really kicked into gear what has become a national movement towards smarter, more effective, more cost-effective, more humane criminal justice policies, and it did start here. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about where the state has been, where it is going. And we have a fabulous panel to do that with a number of different perspectives today. We have District Attorney Kim Ogg, was one of the leading new voices in prosecution around the country. Everybody's bios are in on your app and your other materials, so I'm not going to take a while to do that, especially because we got a late start. We have Jenny Kim from Koch Industries, who's been a leader nationally and around the country on these as well. From there, we have Doug Smith, who's a leading voice here in Texas on these issues, and of course Representative Moody from the legislature as well. So let's get started, and I'd like to do that by looking back at the accomplishments that this state has had over the past decade in both criminal and juvenile justice. And if you could take out your quick fact sheets here that folks at TPPF and some of the other organizations to the center right around the country help put together, showing really what's happened over here over the past decade. It strikes me, and I'll just sort of kick off the conversation by pulling out what strikes me about this, is that for 40 years or more, the conventional wisdom was that if you wanted crime to go down, prisons had to go up. Simple as that. We kind of call it the X chart, and this notion that there's this very simple mechanical and inverse relationship between crime and imprisonment. And what you notice about what's happened here in Texas, and one of the reasons why I think Texas has had such influence around the country, is because you all are showing here through what you're doing that it is possible to reduce crime and incarceration at the same time. So that's what leaps out to me from here. Representative Moody, can we start with you with respect to your impressions of how far the state has come over the past decade?
Where we've come from, where we're going. I started in 2009, and there wasn't, besides maybe Governor Perry, Chairman Madden at the time, there weren't a lot of voices that were allied behind the idea of criminal justice reform. There wasn't a real consensus about what reform meant even back then. But I took a brief break, not by my own choosing, in 2011, then came back in 2013. And by then, TPPF, along with TCJC and some other allied organizations, had really honed in on some priority items. It really developed policy-oriented goals for each session, and had brought together, by that time, they had brought together all three parties that serve in the legislature. And so that was, the real momentum was Rather than having kind of a piecemeal approach, it seemed to be a very comprehensive approach to, let's look at nonviolent offenses, let's figure out how we can track people out that otherwise would be treated as criminals. How do we reduce recidivism? How do we clean up people's criminal records so that they don't have barriers to employment when we come back? So we started looking at things in a broader scope. And also, I mean, I think a big part of that was getting buy-in from all the different angles. People got to those conclusions from different political philosophies, but if you kind of dispensed with how you got there and you agreed on an ultimate goal, then that created a lot of momentum in both chambers. And you know, there's a lot to be said for this organization in leading that charge, along with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition.
Doug, from your perspective.
Well, I think my perspective is somewhat more personal. It's undeniable that the first wave of reform in 2007, when Texas looked at the enormous costs that they were incurring and the exponential growth in the prison population, they realized that this is going to keep happening, that we're going to have to build 3 more prisons, we're going to have to spend $500 million. And so it took Senator Whitmire and this humble engineer, Chairman Madden, who looked at a data-driven approach to finding alternatives. And instead of spending $500 million they spent on new prison facilities, the state spent $250 million on rehabilitation programs. And that first wave was largely centered around the fact that the most risk-averse body in the state of Texas was the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles. They completely closed the revolving door to the extent that people were stacking up one on top of the other. And so this impacted me personally in that I myself was serving time. I was incarcerated in 2008 for crimes that I committed out of desperation for drugs, out of making astonishingly poor choices, mental health issues, and you name it. I committed robbery offenses in order to support my habit. I was placed in, I was given a 15-year sentence, and this was the era where I could expect to serve most of that sentence due to the nature of that crime and due to the nature of it being multiple offenses, not doing particularly well on probation. But because of that data-driven response, the parole board was given a range of options in prison therapeutic communities on the back end, looking at people who are making a sincere effort at rehabilitation and expanding the number of options, intensive supervision in the community and so on. And so instead of serving the full length of my sentence, I served 6 years. And so that impacted me, but that also impacts the community, because here you have someone that the parole board at the same time was reducing revocation rates, is able to support in the community more effectively. And so you see thousands of people who, just like me, who are living healthy, productive lives. I'm able to connect with my daughter again. I'm working a great job being part of the problem, or part of the solution, not part of the problem. You be clear about that. Yes. I made agreements with certain members of the legislature that I wouldn't even jaywalk. So, and so my daughter has a relationship with me. I get to serve on city, county boards. I am a productive member of my community. So that data-driven response impacted human lives and benefited the community. So, I take it from a personal perspective, and I'm very grateful that Texas took the turn.
Can I say, I know they add on to this, and I forgot to mention, I think one of the largest things we've done, and your story really kind of highlights that, is we have taken populations that we criminalized because of mental health issues or substance use issues, and we have taken that conversation out of, we've said this is no longer a criminal justice crisis, this is a health crisis, now let's treat it accordingly. Let's move it out of that sphere and treat it accordingly. Speaker Strauss has really highlighted and elevated those issues, at least on the House side, so that we can stop thinking about things in that way. And I think that was one of the major things that we've done over the last decade.
Jenny, I want to come back to you, but just starting Og, from your perspective, can you talk about, this is Texas here, From the national perspective, Texas has, sort of represents as a very symbol of law and order and being tough. Talk from your perspective for a year now as an elected district attorney, kind of how you process what's been happening here over the past decade.
So I'd like to give you the 30-year view, which is the 50,000-foot view of criminal justice, and a quick history. We were in the middle of a crime wave in the 1980s. Houston was the murder capital of America. My mother had been a crime victim when I was a child. I became a prosecutor because I wanted to make a good living, that kind of thing. And I was struck by the carnage on our streets. And in those days, in the late 80s and early 90s, prisoners were getting out of the Harris County Jail 15 days credit to one, or 30 days. It was crazy. And so we even had serial killers paroled. So I was a red meat eating prosecutor. And I became very conservative about punishment and about crime. And so I came out of that job in 1999, having worked through the 94 Penal Code reform with John Whitmire and many others. I worked for Johnny Holmes. I was the governmental liaison. I would drive witnesses up here in the middle of the night. You know the drill. What happened was we did gain ground. We built prisons. There were supposed to be alternatives called state jails. And there were supposed to be community programs that would address some addiction and treatment issues. But that didn't come to fruition in the way that I think it was envisioned. And what happened is prosecution became more and more conservative. Then add 9/11 to it, police gained more power, they gained public support, and the idea was lock people up. And regardless of what the crime was, it's against the law. We're going to lock them up. Well, in business, of course, resource allocation is your difference between being in the black and being in the red. And having worked then in the next part of my life in public policy, I started really looking at the numbers. I believe we should live within our means. I don't like big deficits. I think we should be smart about the way we spend money. And so I started looking at the data back in the mid-2000s, along with a lot of other people, learning we spend 60 cents out of every dollar on crime, et cetera. So my thought was that we needed to be a lot smarter about how we protect people, and the product that we deliver as local DAs, and we are where the rubber meets the road, was that we needed to turn out a better product for less money. And the only way we could do that in a time of limited resources was to prioritize what we were going to prosecute, how stringently we were going to punish them, et cetera. And it was pretty easy for me. It came down to crimes against people and property. But addiction, mental illness, these were not criminal justice problems, yet they consumed our resources. So the more I became educated about the economics of prosecution, I came to the conclusion we have to reframe the way we look at public safety. We've got to get out of a quantity, and we've got to look at quality prosecutions. And I pushed that theory in my own profession among prosecutors, and there was a real reticence to change the status quo. And so after many years of working to try to change things from within, and I definitely was part of pushing that pendulum to the right back in the early 90s, I took a different approach, saying we've got to be more reasonable. So where we've come is right here. We've seen a coalition of people who basically want to make decisions about government based on the evidence. As a lawyer, that's our training too. Let's make decisions based on the evidence, not emotion. That's not our justice system. So I think we've made great progress. I think that this coalition between the right and the left, if you will, is reason for optimism. It's the only topic that we see a lot of bipartisan support for, and it's because this is the reasonable approach to truly making us safer. And fiscally, it's the only way we can do it. We've got to unload the low-end stuff, treat it, deal with it, quit crippling people's economic opportunities by keeping them in the workforce when we can, and then we have to separate a segment of our community. And when we separate them, we've got to keep them separated. And so it's pretty simple to me. We're on the right track. The people are with us. It's really about political will at this point. That's the way I see it. That's the only thing standing between us and true data-driven reform.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm coming to you in a second here, but I want to stay on the point where she's leaving here.
As you do.
So you give a couple reasons for this, but talk a little bit more, if you would, and Doug and Representative Moody, about how you've been able to hold this coalition together over 10 years. It's really quite remarkable.
Oh, you want my feedback on
Yeah. So it started with Jerry Madden and John Whitmire and TPPF and the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, and you all did these adult reforms and juvenile reforms back in 2007 that have become a model for the nation and are powering all this stuff across the country. And there were certainly fears back in 2007, 2009, okay, we're going to try this, but boy, when that next budget session comes around in 2009, they're never going to fund those same alternative programs again. And then there was the economic downturn, which came here a little bit later in Texas than it did around the country. So certainly in the 2011 session, those programs were going to be cut for mental health and substance abuse, and it didn't happen, and it's held together. So just curious from your perspective, what is it really about the evidence and the public supports this? Is that fundamentally at the end of the day what's happening?
I mean, I think that's a large part of it. It is difficult to keep together any coalition when you're dealing with politicians. There's a lot to be, gained and lost through any single session, and so this is a piece of that. Criminal justice is a piece of that puzzle. But there has been. I think it goes back to what District Attorney Ogg said, that folks out in the community understand this issue. They know that they have people in their family with mental health issues, substance use issues. They've gotten in trouble with the law and at a young age and have a criminal history. It's now tracked them for the rest of their lives, and it's really impeded their ability to have a successful and productive life. And so the folks we represent have these stories, and they exist. And I think that voice has been louder and more, it's been more cohesive. And so it's usually the politicians are the last ones to kind of come across the line to fix these things. But because that voice has grown louder and more, cohesive over the years, you have a coalition of folks that have seen the results. And then when you have the data that comes back and says this is working, we are making a difference in our communities and across the state, there's a lot of value to that. I mean, as an elected official, you want to know that what you're doing, well, some of us anyway, you want to know what you're doing is making a difference, a positive difference. And so this is one of those ways to do that. Plus, you've been given, I think some people have been given the opportunity to really take the lead on this. There was a little bit of a vacuum here. Back in 07, 09, in that area, that area of time, there was a vacuum, and so people were allowed to step into that and really own this issue, and that's continued down over the last decade.
Doug?
Yeah, I think I was sitting in prison in 2011. I went to the library to read the newspaper, and I read about this crazy conservative guy advocating for criminal justice reform and galvanizing conservatives. That was you, Mark. We read about you. And, flash forward several years, and I'm sitting in the same room in Texas Association of Business, and we're meeting on this common ground. And that common ground is not about we need to save the state money. That was not the common ground. The common ground was around human potential. It was about the potential that we're losing. It was about the people whose lives could have been set on track and instead went onto a trajectory that led them into prison where they didn't get to raise their own children and so on. That's the common ground on which we meet. I think that we're all steeped in the data, and I think this movement is getting smarter. It was pretty smart in 2007, and it is getting smarter every year. The wealth of knowledge in Mark's head and Dr. Cohen's head is astonishes me, and we all have to stay on our toes. And I know that that's what sets Texas apart in a lot of ways. But I think what also keeps us together is also learning to disagree. There are people who, this is a movement where nationally we're beginning to see that these are absurdly, indefensibly high incarceration rates, 10 to 50 times higher than they need to be, depending on what population you're looking at. And so there are movements sort of building locally around this. And so district attorney candidates are hearing from constituents about this. Judicial candidates are hearing about this. This is part of the change. And I think that we've learned to recognize that there's a lot of pressure to move faster and so on. And so there's tension between the groups. And because we have such good relationships, because we meet on that common ground of human potential, we're able to disagree, we're able to push the envelope. We've made progress, but we are not finished. There's a lot more to be done.
Can you pick up on that right there and talk a little bit about what the progress here, and I don't hear anybody declaring success and saying that the era of reform here is over. There's still a long way to go, but
then
the extent that
kind of would become like President George W. Bush when he
mission accomplished.
The
We're not there yet. We're not hanging any banners today. But talk about how the progress here has, in fact, impacted what's going on around the country that you're so involved in.
Well, I think once Texas started, and so for me, I kind of frame it this way. For a lot of folks that I talk to about why criminal justice reform is important, people often come for the fiscal reason, but they find salvation by the end. It's a moral reason as well. We are blessed in this country. We have lots of land. We can drive anywhere. We can go anywhere. Unfortunately, I think a little bit of that means that we tend to just dump things into basements and then rent out more storage cases for things we don't want to really self-examine. And I think to a certain extent in the 80s and 90s, that's what happened. And so when you guys were willing to kind of take out and realize all the human potential you lost, because for example, the inventor of the vulcanized rubber, Goodyear, was regularly in jail for debt all the time. If he were under this system, he would never have invented vulcanized rubber. So, what kind of potential are we missing? And that's where Texas got it started. And I think other governors and other legislatures looked at that too. I mean, they looked at it from a fiscal perspective, but they looked at it also from a moral and constitutional perspective as well, right? Conservatives are all about liberty, and they're about, limited government. And so that's, where they kept on going. Now, we're, I think, sort of at a point where we have plateaued a little bit. And so it's like trying to lose the last 10 pounds. And I think a lot of us, unless you're blessed with a metabolism different than mine, probably have been there. I'm always there after the holidays. But I think that's where we are, and it's thinking about also, the reentry process, right? I think everyone has reentry programs, everyone has reentry plans. I think, some states probably implement better than others. But how can the existing services, and by that I mean both government and private, how can the existing services come together, be better, and kind of work more aligned together? And also how those existing services, because I heard a very unique term the other day in Philadelphia called pre-entry, which is take those concepts as re-entry and transfer it over into the diversion and alternatives to incarceration approach as well. Because often when people make their touch points with the criminal justice system, it really isn't just, they wanted to do something wrong and they want to go visit the insides of a jail or a prison. It's also that there may be certain circumstances. They don't understand what services are available. They don't understand what resources are available. They don't have a whole lot of support. Very few Americans have even $1,000 in their savings account. So those are things that, how can you take the concepts that you take from rebuilding a person after prison, but also use those concepts as well for the pre-entry part in the diversion and alternatives to incarceration, which is why, and I'm sure you guys have all heard nonstop from Justin and John Kufos and Derek and Mark Levin, and Mark Levin's nodding, of course you were telling everyone, about the initiative, Safe Streets and Second Chances, that has been launched. It is in partnership with Koch Industries. Right on Crime, and with Florida State University and the Charles Koch Foundation. Florida State University's incoming professor, Carrie Pettis-Davis, will be the principal researcher. And thank you to the Texas Department of Corrections, because they are working with her right now, because it is one of the pilot states. But what that Safe Streets and Second Chances really wants to be about is to research existing services, existing parameters, and figure out how to make these better using evidence-driven practices, and not just, good intentions are great, but we need evidence. Everyone on the stage right now has talked about how evidence has caused them to relook at everything, parse things out. What are we missing in the reentry to make it even better, and to continue to make it better? Those are the questions that we have, and this is what we hope to do with this. Again, but we are not recreating a brand new reentry service, because that's been a question that's come up a lot, but it's instead looking at the states of Texas, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, to really look at the existing services and how can we make them better, and then also how can we reuse those concepts throughout other parts of the criminal justice system, to figure out, what sort of some of the societal ills, and then kind of help. And we kind of look at everything as a truly comprehensive approach at Koch. So we're also looking at education and mental and health services and everything else, because the criminal justice system has for a long time been very siloed, but it's more than that. It's everything else in society has gone wrong for that person, and not making excuses for that person, but how can we make sure that they don't keep on making the wrong choices, and help them to recognize within, create that self-awareness, not just about a job, but also community. I had the good fortune to visit Uplift, which is run in Philadelphia, just outside of Philadelphia, in conjunction with a Baptist church, which was humongous, 18,000 congregants. I was very impressed. So they are really, really good, and we got to meet some of the class participants. And the thing that struck me is that they found within that class what we kind of take for granted: friendships, communities, families, feeling fulfilled in our jobs, some days more than others. And that's what they talked about. And those are the things we kind of take for granted, and those are the types of things that Professor Carrie Pettis-Davis is looking to figure out and implement, right? It's the job, it's the cognitive ability, it's the mental health services, it's community and family, and how to bring all those pieces in so that it's a holistic reentry, as opposed to just here's your bus ticket, here's your P card, bye.
Thanks, Jenny. You and others have talked about a few of the conservative principles that underlie criminal justice reform, which right, is not necessarily something that naturally is going to be understood by people. Why are conservatives embracing something that feels like it's been more of a liberal issue over the years? And you talked about fiscal responsibility and limited government, public safety, government accountability. You also touched on an aspect I'd like to return to you on, and also asked District Attorney Ogg about, and that is the role of community. On our work at Pew, a lot of the Texas Public Policy Foundation work, we're all focused on how can we make government decision-making better, how can we make government processes work better. But this is not an issue that's going to be solved by government and government alone. It's not going to be something you can fund another government program to solve. You've got to involve communities. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit sort of that aspect of conservatism, and particular District Attorney, how you're engaging with communities in order to help solve these problems.
Well, I think there's two major segments of the community that have not just a fiscal interest, but also a human interest. So business has a fiscal interest in having a workforce that matches the economy that we want to foster in this state. We've got to have a qualified workforce. If we disqualify 100,000 people by giving them convictions for inconsequential crimes such as possession of marijuana, misdemeanor level, over 10 years, we convicted 100,000 people. That's 100,000 fewer people eligible for jobs in our refineries, non-college jobs, jobs that pay a good wage, 60, 70, 80,000 bucks. Professions that require bonding, ACs, plumbers. I mean, we're knocking a lot of people out, and it's one thing to knock them out at 18, but when they're still knocked out at 30, you've got a big, big problem. So I think that business has a major stake in this issue in terms of over-incarceration and the downside of that. Now, back to victims. Again, I do not come from this, at this problem from an offender-centric perspective. My perspective, because of my experience and my family, is victim-centric. So as I grew as a lawyer over the years and talked to witnesses and lawyers, victims did not, they were not being represented politically by the people who claimed that we're representing them. That was mostly us, prosecutors. In fact, victims were not, I don't believe their perspective was really requested as much. It was put forth by people who claimed to speak on their behalf. But when I would talk to victims, rape victims, murder victims, surviving family members, robbery victims, you know, they didn't want police time being spent on criminal mischief cases or on trespass cases. They wanted rape kits tested. They wanted aggravated robbers caught. They wanted better police practices that would ensure the convictions would stand. And all of us, as science advanced, wanted to make sure we had the right guy. And I think that's the kind of thing that appeals to us on a human level. It's far past, it's beyond our political nature. It's intrinsic to us. We believe in freedom and we believe in public safety, but we want to make sure we got the right guy. So I think the way we hold the coalition together is with people and with a strong economic case that the way we've been doing it isn't making us safer. We can do a lot better and actually make ourselves safer by improving the chances of the average Joe in the workforce if basically what he's done are nuisance crimes. Possession of controlled substance, it's felony, it's on their record forever, even if they got it deferred, and it does make a difference in job applications. So I think that we hold this coalition of like-minded folks together with the human and the fiscal approach.
Thanks. Jenny, your thoughts on this?
So I think the thing that I've always been struck with as I've started working on this is that with respect to ban the box and giving those with criminal records a second chance, is that many in the advocate world and even some in the government world don't understand how businesses work and how HR departments work now. They seem to still think that everything goes by paper and some human being is actually reviewing the words on the paper. And that, because of technological advances, that's not so anymore. You submit on the internet and then it goes through some algorithms, and if you don't have the right keywords in that resume, you're not even gonna ever get picked up. And you're usually going to have someone sort of tell you, because businesses like District Attorney Ogg said, they're really interested in being in the black. If they're in the red, then they're gonna go bye-bye. So those are the sort of things that helping people understand, and then also for businesses to be able to kind of look beyond their sort of mechanisms and the expectation that, and I'm a compliance lawyer, so I can't tell you how many times I've heard people tell me, the form says I can't do this. Well, does the form stand up and dance, and does the form speak back to you? We created the form, so we should redo the form if the process is not working anymore. So those are the sort of things that I think we sort of don't really use our heads as much anymore as we used to. And so, thinking about how businesses can help, there's all sorts of different ways businesses can help. They can just start by hiring one person with a criminal record and see how that goes, just one person. Now, if you are in a business that unfortunately has a lot of regulatory barriers about hiring people with criminal records, then those are the sort of things that need to be raised, especially I know that there's a lot of federal regulatory barriers in addition, and particularly in the ports. Elaine Ellerby had mentioned that to me once upon a time, that the TWIC cards for the refinery workers near the port areas, if you have any sort of felony conviction, then you're probably going to get denied that first time, and you're going to have to go through an unnecessary appeal. So businesses, and then also go into the prisons if you can, and see and meet these people and understand that they all have hopes, aspirations, and dreams. And actually, yesterday I was in Michigan and visited the Hanlon Correctional Facility, where they have a vocational village, and also Calvin College comes and gives BAs out, 5-year college program for those who are serving in prison, even those who are serving for life. And the interesting thing is the vocational schools are what your traditional welding, tools, carpentry. I was very impressed because I can't even draw a straight line with a ruler. But there's math and algebra and a lot of arithmetic involved in that. And what they do to sort of leverage each other's resources is the Calvin students are the math tutors to the folks in the vocational village. And they tutor them every night for about an hour or two. And it's that kind of synergy and kind of seeing those programs. I think it's, that's where business has a labor need right now. And we can't just kind of discount everyone based on a criminal record, but because our systems are automated, there's more information out there on everyone. It just becomes easier to do that because based on the information outputs that are coming. But that's really the opportunity, as people would say, to leverage artificial intelligence and to look beyond. Think about how to inform that in your decision making, because this involves human labor, the human heart, not just a couple of numbers.
Great. There's so much I want to say with what you just shared. It's truly amazing. But to the community-based response, I think that one of the throughout sort of the iterations of reform, we've largely been doing a lot of high-level policy work, data-driven work, and I think that one of the things that's really exciting about the Smart on Crime Coalition here in Texas is that we truly are engaging the community around problem solving. We realize that, for instance, with state jail felonies, our 4th degree felony, possession, property offenses, things of that nature, that we're achieving astonishingly poor outcomes. There's very little access to treatment in these facilities. People are being released with no post-release supervision, very little reentry supports. They're sent back to the community to the exact same circumstance from which they came. There's a 62.7% rearrest rate within this population. And just about everyone in the state agrees that we need to fix this system. But the thing is that we've known that for quite a long time. And what we're doing now differently through the Smart on Crime Coalition is truly engaging the community. We're going on our 3rd stakeholder meeting, working with community members, people who work within the criminal justice system, and also community partners, and asking questions about what would it look like if you as a community came together to lower the amount of drug use within your community, lower property crime rates without using incarceration as your tool. And people have enormous amounts of ideas around that. It's just that the way that we fund the criminal justice system, the lion's share of the funds go towards incarceration. And so having discussions about how to shift that, how to incentivize reductions in state jail populations in order to augment the types of services like what's happening in Harris County, where they work with all defendants charged with possession of a controlled substance or prostitution offenses, and immediately try to get the individuals out onto PR bonds, immediately try to access services. If the services aren't immediately available, do bridging strategies, working with peer support in the community to help the individual to navigate the system towards treatment. It's working. The numbers look fantastic. They've served about 6,800 people. They've reduced jail bed days by 100,000. So they're reducing not only state costs, they're sending fewer people to state jail, they're also reducing their own costs. And so to the extent that the state can incentivize that, the state stands to gain enormous benefits in terms of human potential and tax savings. So that's a community partnership, the extent to which we can work with communities to fund what works. I could say similar things around young adults, but I don't want to steal the mic.
Let's hit pause there for a second, but come back to you, because you just threw out a lot of things, and our last sort of group question before we shift into Q&A here is going to be to each of you, what is the most important thing? There are a lot of things that need to be done, but what's the most important thing, the most important priority you would identify for this state for the next year, whether it's on the adult side or the juvenile side, reentry or otherwise, government, state level, local level? What's the most important thing that can happen in this state over the next year heading into the 2019 legislative session? And let's start with Representative Moody. You're on the spot.
I would usually have a hard time shoehorning my issue related to marijuana into every conversation, but this is an easy one. So thank
Glad
you.
to have opened the door.
Do I think it's the most important thing? No, but I do think it's an important piece of the puzzle. And the reason why it's not the most important thing is because community leaders, prosecutors are taking the lead within their discretion to treat that offense correctly within, like out in Harris County, Kim has done a fantastic job prioritizing that offense the way it should be. I know other prosecutors around the state are looking at different ways to do that. And that's one of the blessings we have is a very diverse group of prosecutors and community leaders that are doing those things within their community, and they don't have to wait on the legislature, which is nice because the legislature doesn't always act quickly. So I will put that in. I think that it's something we should continue to look at a statewide level so we can create some uniformity. But I think if I had to kind of distill down to the main issue we really haven't tackled well, it has to do with our criminal history records. The major barrier to employment will be that criminal history record. We've heard about that already. The main thing that will lead to reoffending for someone that's come out is that they don't have a job. If you're unemployed, you're more likely to go back into the system. And so we've created a massive amount of criminal history for folks for various levels of offenses. And we just need to decide as policymakers which ones we feel we can say goodbye to and how long we have to wait, how long someone has to wait or be on good behavior to where we make that decision. And that's been a very large discussion from the lowest level offenses to felony offenses. And so we need to make that is, I think, probably the largest and most difficult question that policymakers have to get into, because you cannot hold certain things. I don't think you should hold certain things over people's head for the rest of their lives. I do criminal defense work. I've got 17-year-olds that I'm meeting with that have been charged with minor crimes, and some of them have, some of them were ready to plead guilty, and I think had they got another attorney who was looking for expediency over quality outcome for that individual, they probably would have that for the rest of their life. And so, those are the things that I think that's probably the major, that's the broad issue that we really need to tackle as a legislature.
Yeah, thank you. District Attorney?
Mental health, drug policy reform, and application of the saved resources to smarter crime-fighting strategies, period. In the legislature, my push is going to be for protection of criminal records. Everybody's great on first offenders. Most everybody gets probation, pretrial intervention. They didn't used to. They used to take the time. I think we've turned that corner where more people are getting help earlier in the system, but it's the first offenders. So my marijuana program extends to all people in possession of misdemeanor amounts of marijuana, regardless of record. Why did I do that? Disparate enforcement. It's easy. Equal justice. People have to trust our system. And if our communities of color don't trust our system, our democracy is in jeopardy. And I believe if you, across the board, make things available to people, we've not seen a spike in crime, just the opposite. In fact, we filed more robberies and more burglaries last year because we filed 10,000 fewer marijuana cases. Ask any victim out there, any citizen out there, would you rather have your burglary investigated, or would you rather get the kid across the street who's got a joint in his pocket and is smoking in the alleyway? We all know the answer to that. So these are common sense issues that are very popular with the public, but we have reticent public will. We have reticent political will. And I did run for DA because I had the discretion to do things that would help prove this theory, that we can be safer when we're smarter, rather than run for the legislature. I had worked in the legislature just on behalf of different policy makers, elected officials. Legislature is a body that will move at its own pace, and so I wanted to build the case myself. And that's why I ran for DA. I thought we could do it better. I thought we could make people safer. So expunctions, mental health is soaking up your resources. And it's a state problem that's been pushed to the lowest level. Taxpayers at the county level are paying for it almost entirely. At its heart, it's not criminal, it's public health. Obviously, we have to protect ourselves from violent, mentally ill people. We can do a better job of that when we're not wasting millions of dollars of our resources basically jailing homeless, mentally ill, addicted people. We've got to have a solution for that. Otherwise, we end up looking like the other large urban areas where you're stepping over homeless people as you make your way to the courthouse. So we've got to protect business owners and keep those trespassers off their property so that they can do business. But seriously, treating them by throwing them in the Harris County Jail for 180 days where they serve more than certain violent criminals who commit assault, domestic violence, that kind of thing, it's ridiculous. And this is common sense. The people are with us. And I think that's why it's important. That's why I used to take those victims to talk to legislators. It worked. It worked. They have standing in a way that most people can't comprehend. So mental health, drug policy reform, better ways of using the limited resources that we've got. And by the way, a lot of law enforcement believes this. Not everybody. There's certainly a cultural and philosophical battle going on. But I believe that if you really want to help people, this is the way we're going to do it.
Thanks, Doug. If you had the magic wand.
Well, all of the above. I'm going to push the envelope and bring up something that hasn't been brought up yet, and that's about new directions when it comes to young adults in the system. What we know about young adults due to the increasing amount of brain science is that they're not fully developed in terms of executive function, abstract reasoning, long-term planning, and things like that. What we know about the population